In the early 20th century, Europe stood at the height of its power. Industrial cities were growing rapidly, empires stretched across continents, and technological advancements were transforming society. But beneath this progress, a dangerous tension was building. Powerful nations like Germany, Britain, France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary were competing for influence, territory, and military strength. They were forming alliances, expanding their armies, and preparing for a war many believed was inevitable. Officially, Europe was at peace, but behind closed doors, governments and military leaders were secretly planning for a massive conflict. When World War I finally began in 1914, it shocked the world. Yet, for many generals and politicians, the war had already been planned years before. These were the secret plans that helped start World War I. Europe on the edge of war. By the early 1900s, Europe was divided into two powerful alliance systems. The first was the Triple Alliance, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Opposing them was the Triple Entente, which included Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances were supposed to maintain peace by balancing power. However, they also created a dangerous situation. If one country went to war, its allies would be pulled into the conflict. This meant that a small regional dispute could quickly escalate into a continent-wide war. And because each nation expected war to come sooner or later, they began preparing detailed military strategies in secret. Germany's master plan, the Schlieffen Plan. Germany faced a serious strategic problem. If war broke out, Germany would have to fight two powerful enemies at the same time, France in the west and Russia in the east. German military leaders believed fighting on two fronts would be extremely dangerous. To solve this problem, German General Alfred von Schlieffen created a bold and ambitious strategy. The plan was simple in theory. Germany would first launch a massive, lightning-fast attack against France. Instead of attacking directly across the border, German forces would move through the neutral country of Belgium. By sweeping around French defenses and quickly capturing Paris, Germany hoped to defeat France within weeks. After that, German forces would shift eastward to fight Russia, whose army was expected to mobilize slowly. This strategy depended on speed, precision, and surprise. But it also had a huge risk. Invading Belgium could bring Britain into the war. Despite this danger, Germany decided the plan was worth the risk. France's Plan 17. France also had its own secret military strategy. This plan was known as Plan 17. France had never forgotten the humiliation of losing the territories of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. French military leaders believed that the best strategy was to attack aggressively and reclaim these lost lands. Plan 17 focused on launching a rapid offensive into German territory. French commanders believed that courage, determination, and offensive spirit would overcome the enemy. However, they underestimated the strength of German defenses and the deadly power of modern weapons, such as machine guns and heavy artillery. Russia's war preparations. Russia possessed one of the largest armies in the world, but it also had major weaknesses. Its railways were limited, its supply systems were inefficient, and mobilizing millions of soldiers took a long time. Despite these challenges, Russia had a clear strategy. If war broke out, Russia would mobilize its massive army and attack Germany from the east. This would force Germany to divide its forces between two fronts, giving France a better chance of surviving in the west. Russia also promised to defend Serbia if it came under attack from Austria-Hungary. This promise would soon prove critical. Britain's quiet military planning. Britain did not officially commit to a detailed war plan like Germany or France. However, British military leaders had quietly prepared for the possibility of conflict. Britain maintained the most powerful navy in the world. Its main goal was to protect trade routes and maintain control of the seas. In case of war with Germany, Britain planned to use its navy to blockade German ports. This would cut off Germany's supplies and weaken its economy. Britain also planned to send a small but highly trained force known as the British Expeditionary Force to assist France if war broke out. Although Britain had not formally promised to join a war, these preparations showed that the country was ready. The spark, the assassination in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, a dramatic event took place in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was visiting the region of Bosnia. A group of Serbian nationalists known as the Black Hand had planned to assassinate him. One of the conspirators, a young man named Gavrilo Princip, managed to shoot the Archduke and his wife as their car passed through the city. The assassination shocked Europe, but more importantly, it triggered the chain reaction that military leaders had long prepared for. Austria-Hungary's decision. Austria-Hungary believed that Serbia was responsible for the assassination. Before taking action, Austria sought support from its powerful ally, Germany. Germany responded by offering full backing to Austria-Hungary. Historians later called this the blank check. With German support guaranteed, Austria-Hungary sent a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia agreed to most of the demands but refused to accept all of them. For Austria-Hungary, this was enough justification for war. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The domino effect. Once the first declaration of war was made, the alliance system quickly pulled the rest of Europe into the conflict. Russia began mobilizing its army to defend Serbia. Germany viewed this mobilization as a direct threat and declared war on Russia. Soon after, Germany declared war on France. Following the Schlieffen Plan, German troops invaded Belgium to reach France. Belgium's neutrality had been guaranteed by Britain. When Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, the British government faced a difficult decision. Some politicians hoped Britain could stay out of the conflict, but others believed that allowing Germany to dominate Europe would threaten British security and power. On August 4, 1914, Britain officially declared war on Germany. The British Expeditionary Force, though small compared to other armies, was highly trained and professional. British soldiers were quickly sent to France to join the fighting. With Britain now involved, the conflict was no longer just a European war. Because of the British Empire, countries and colonies from around the world would soon be drawn into the fighting. The war spreads across the world. As the major European powers entered the conflict, their colonies and allies followed. Soldiers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and Africa joined the war effort. The Ottoman Empire eventually joined the Central Powers, aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, Japan joined the Allies and attacked German territories in Asia. What had begun as a regional conflict in Europe quickly turned into a global war. Battles were fought not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. For the first time in history, war truly became worldwide. The Western Front stalemate. Germany's plan to quickly defeat France began to fail. In September 1914, German forces approached Paris, but French and British troops launched a powerful counterattack during the First Battle of the Marne. The German advance was finally stopped. After this battle, both sides began digging long defensive trenches. These trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across France and Belgium. This became known as the Western Front. Life in the trenches was brutal. Soldiers lived in mud, cold, and constant danger from artillery and machine guns. Battles often lasted months, yet gained only a few miles of territory. The war that was expected to end quickly had turned into a long and deadly stalemate. The Eastern Front. While the Western Front became locked in trench warfare, the Eastern Front was much more fluid. Russia launched major attacks against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Early in the war, Russian forces invaded East Prussia. However, German commanders quickly responded. In the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, German forces surrounded and destroyed a large Russian army. Despite this victory, fighting in the East continued for years. The Eastern Front stretched across vast territories and millions of soldiers fought in massive battles. Russia suffered enormous losses, which eventually contributed to political unrest at home. New technology and the horrors of modern war. World War I introduced terrifying new weapons and technologies. Machine guns could fire hundreds of bullets per minute, making direct attacks incredibly deadly. Heavy artillery shells destroyed entire battlefields and caused massive casualties. Poison gas was introduced, creating horrific injuries and panic among soldiers. Later in the war, tanks and airplanes began appearing on the battlefield. These technologies changed warfare forever. The secret military plans created before the war had not fully prepared armies for the destructive power of these modern weapons. As a result, the war became far more brutal than anyone had imagined. The war that changed the world. By the time the war finally ended in 1918, the consequences were devastating. Over 16 million people had lost their lives. 4 major empires collapsed: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. New countries were created, borders were redrawn, and the balance of power in Europe was permanently changed. But perhaps the most important consequence was that the peace that followed the war would eventually lead to another global conflict just 2 decades later. When the war began in 1914, many leaders believed it would end.
The ending that was never written. Long after the war ended, the world moved on. Cities were rebuilt. Borders were redrawn. New generations grew up without knowing the fear of occupation. And the man at the center of this story, he blended back into ordinary life. No interviews, no medals on display, no recognition from strangers. To most people, he was just another face in the crowd. But inside him lived memories of moments when everything could have ended, and didn't. What war really leaves behind. War doesn't just leave ruins on maps. It leaves quiet survivors. People who learned how fragile control really is. People who saw how quickly power collapses when belief disappears. People who understand that strength means nothing without resolve. This man carried those lessons for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about what happened, and when he did, he never called himself brave. He simply said he did what he had to do. Why this story still matters? Because the world still believes the same lie, that power is permanent, that control is absolute, that once someone is defeated, their story is over. History proves otherwise. Again and again, it shows us that underestimating people is dangerous, especially in moments when they appear weakest. That mistake has been made before, and it will be made again. The final truth. They thought he was finished. They were wrong. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was the loudest, but because he refused to accept the ending written for him. And as long as even one person refuses to give up, no victory is ever complete, and no defeat is ever final. Closing line, perfect for fade out. Wars are remembered for their battles. History is changed by those who refuse to disappear. The stories we never count. When wars are written into history books, they are reduced to dates, maps, and outcomes. Millions become statistics, decisions become paragraphs, suffering becomes footnotes. But wars are not lived in textbooks. They are lived by individuals, by moments where someone is pushed to the edge and must decide who they really are. This man was one of those moments. Why so many stories end too early? Most people assume that when someone is captured, injured, or isolated, their role in history is over, that survival itself is the ending. But survival is not passive. Survival is active. It requires thinking, patience, restraint, and timing. It requires choosing hope when fear is the logical response. This is why his story matters, not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. The invisible impact. No official record ever measured the effect of his actions. No document can tell us how many decisions were delayed, how many mistakes were made, how many lives were indirectly saved because confusion spread where certainty once existed. But historians agree on one thing. Wars don't collapse from one blow. They collapse from thousands of small fractures. And he was one of those fractures. A pattern repeated in history. This is not the only time history has followed this pattern. Empires fall not when they are weakest, but when they believe they are untouchable. They stop questioning, they stop listening, they stop noticing the quiet resistance. That is always the beginning of the end. What this means today. This story is not just about World War II. It's about power, about arrogance, about what happens when people are underestimated. The world still repeats these mistakes again and again, which is why stories like this must be told, even when they don't fit neatly into headlines. When silence becomes the loudest proof. After everything he survived, what stayed with him was not fear, but silence. Silence after explosions, silence after shouting, silence after realizing he was still alive when others were not. That silence followed him long after the war ended. People assumed survival meant peace. It didn't. Survival meant remembering. The weight of being misjudged. He often thought about how easily he had been dismissed, not as a threat, not as important, not as someone worth watching. That misjudgment saved him, and it revealed something dangerous about power. Those who believe they have total control stop paying attention to the quiet ones. History shows this again and again. The biggest failures rarely come from strong enemies, they come from underestimated ones. The difference between defeat and endurance. Defeat is visible, endurance is quiet. This man endured hunger, fear, isolation, and uncertainty, not because he believed he would become a hero, but because giving up felt worse than continuing. He did not fight every day. He did not win every moment, but he kept going, and sometimes that is enough to change outcomes. What history chooses to remember. History remembers victory parades. It remembers speeches and flags, but it rarely remembers restraint, patience, observation. It rarely remembers the people who waited and acted only when it mattered most. This story exists to correct that imbalance. A final layer of meaning. They thought he was finished because they believed weakness is permanent. They were wrong. Weakness can be temporary. Resolve can be permanent. And when resolve outlasts power, power eventually collapses. The long road after escape. After everything he survived, life did not suddenly become easier. Escape did not mean safety. Freedom did not mean peace. For weeks, sometimes months, he lived with constant uncertainty. He moved through forests, villages, and ruined roads where every sound could be danger. Hunger was normal. Sleep was a risk. The war was still everywhere. He learned to measure time differently, not by days, but by moments of safety. A quiet hour, a trusted face, a door that stayed closed when footsteps passed by. These small victories kept him alive. Trust was the rarest resource. One of the hardest lessons he learned was this: not everyone could be trusted. Some people helped out of courage, others helped out of fear. Some pretended to help while planning betrayal. He had to read people quickly, their eyes, their pauses, their tone of voice. A single wrong judgment could end everything. So he became careful, quiet, observant. The same traits that had kept him alive as a prisoner now protected him in freedom. How ordinary people became part of the story. What surprised him most was who helped him. Not soldiers, not leaders, ordinary civilians. Farmers who shared food they barely had. Families who hid strangers knowing the risk. Messengers who carried words without knowing their meaning. These people never saw themselves as heroes. They simply refused to look away. And without them, survival would have been impossible. The mental war. The enemy still believed in control. They believed checkpoints, patrols, and fear were enough. But something subtle was happening. Information was slipping through. Movements were being observed. Patterns were being learned. Even without direct combat, the balance was shifting. Because war is not only fought with weapons,
It is fought with awareness, and awareness was spreading where fear once lived. When the body weakens but the mind sharpens. Physically, he was exhausted, weight lost, strength reduced, injuries never fully healed, but mentally he was sharper than ever. He understood routines, he understood pressure, he understood that people under stress repeat mistakes. That understanding became his advantage. He no longer rushed decisions, he waited, and waiting in war can be more powerful than action. Moments that nearly ended everything. There were times he came terrifyingly close to capture, a patrol turning a corner too early, a knock on the wrong door, a question asked 1 second too long. Each time, survival depended on calm. No sudden movements, no panic, just stillness. Later, he would realize how thin the line had been, how easily the story could have ended there. Why this part of the story matters. This phase of his journey is rarely told because it lacks drama. No explosions, no speeches, no clear victories. But this is where most courage exists, in endurance, in restraint, in continuing when no one is watching. This is the part of war that breaks most people. It did not break him. Setting up the final meaning. By the time the war began to turn decisively, his role was nearly complete. Not because he was no longer needed, but because what he represented had already spread. The belief that control was not absolute, that fear could be navigated, that being underestimated could be turned into strength. They thought he was finished. What they never understood was this: he had only changed form.